I thought being forced into a marriage would be the worst thing that could happen to me, but I was wrong, because the real nightmare began when he looked at me like I didn't exist. The room still smelled like fresh flowers and expensive perfume, but none of it belonged to me, none of it felt real, and neither did the man standing across from me. Adjusting his cufflinks like this was just another business arrangement, another contract signed and sealed, another life acquired without question. Victor Hale didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, didn't even bother pretending this was anything more than what it was, and when his eyes finally met mine, cold and unreadable, he said it so simply it almost didn't register at first, "You mean nothing." I didn't cry, not then, not in front of him, not when my entire life had just been reduced to a sentence so small it barely filled the silence between us, because somewhere deep inside, something in me refused to break that easily, even if everything else already had. 72 hours earlier, I was still Emily Carter, still pretending I had choices, still believing that if I worked hard enough, if I kept my head down, I could outrun the mistakes my father made. But debts don't disappear, they wait, they grow, and eventually, they come to collect. I remember the paper they slid across the table, the weight of the pen in my hand, the way my father couldn't look at me as he whispered, "This is the only way," and I signed it because there was no other option, because walking away would have destroyed him, and I thought maybe I could survive anything if it meant keeping him safe. I was wrong about that too. The wedding wasn't a wedding, it was a transaction dressed in white, held in a room too large and too quiet, filled with men in tailored suits who watched me like I was part of the deal, not the bride, not a person, just an exchange. No music, no laughter, no warmth, just the sound of my own heartbeat and the echo of footsteps as Victor Hale entered, every movement controlled, every glance calculated, the kind of man who didn't need to demand attention because the world had already learned to give it to him. He didn't look at me when we said the vows, didn't hesitate when he signed his name, and when it was over, just like that, I belonged to him in every way that mattered on paper, but not in the ways that made a marriage real. Now here I was, standing in a room that was supposed to mark the beginning of something, and instead, it felt like the end of everything I used to be. He turned away from me after those 3 words, like the conversation was already finished, like I wasn't worth another second of his time, and for a moment, I almost believed him, almost let that sentence define me, but then I felt it, quiet and steady beneath the fear, a refusal to disappear, a stubborn piece of myself that wouldn't accept being nothing, no matter how powerful the man in front of me was. I didn't know what this life would demand from me, didn't know how far his world would pull me in, but I knew one thing as I stood there in silence, watching the man who owned everything walk away without looking back. I might have been forced into this marriage, but I wasn't going to become invisible. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid of him, but because I realized fear would have been easier than this silence, easier than being ignored in a house that was too large, too quiet, too controlled, like every wall had been trained to listen and never speak back. The bed behind me was untouched, the sheets still perfectly smooth as if they were waiting for a version of this marriage that would never exist, and I stood there for what felt like hours before I finally moved, not because I knew what to do, but because standing still made me feel exactly like what he had called me, nothing. The hallway outside the room stretched longer than it had any right to, lined with dim lights and closed doors, each one hiding a part of a life I did not belong to, and as I walked, I noticed something strange. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no signs that anyone actually lived here, just perfection, just order, just control. This was not a home, it was a system, and I had just been inserted into it. A woman in a black uniform appeared at the end of the corridor as if she had been waiting for me to step out, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that is practiced over years of knowing exactly what not to say. "Mrs. Hale," she said, and the title felt foreign, heavy, like it did not belong on me, like it was something I had borrowed and would be asked to return at any moment. "Mr. Hale has arranged for your schedule," she continued, holding out a tablet with both hands, not offering it casually, but presenting it like something official, something that could not be questioned. I looked at it without taking it, my eyes scanning the list of times and activities: breakfast at 8, wardrobe fitting at 10, language tutor at 1, dinner at 7, every hour accounted for, every minute planned, as if my existence needed structure in order to be tolerated. "I did not ask for this," I said quietly, more to myself than to her, but she heard me anyway. "Mr. Hale believes structure provides comfort," she replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was not a belief, it was a rule. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was the first time I understood him even a little, a man who controlled everything so completely that even emotions had to be scheduled, even people had to be managed like assets. "Where is he?" I asked, and for the first time, her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "Mr. Hale does not take breakfast here," she said, choosing her words carefully, "and he will not be returning until this evening." Of course he would not, because why would he be? I was not something he needed to see, not something he needed to acknowledge, just something that existed now within his world, like furniture, like walls, like silence. I handed the tablet back without touching it, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I felt that same quiet resistance rise again, the same refusal to be reduced to a list of instructions. "Tell him I will not follow a schedule I did not choose," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was not, and for a moment, the air between us felt different, not tense, not dangerous, just uncertain, like I had done something that did not fit within the rules of this place. She hesitated, just for a second, before nodding once, a small, almost invisible movement, and I realized then that maybe I was not the only one living inside something controlled. I turned away before she could respond, walking down the hallway without a destination, without a plan, but with something I had not felt since I signed that paper, a small, fragile sense that I still had a choice, even if it was only in how I refused to disappear. I did not expect the house to respond to me, but it did, not with words, not with confrontation, but with a shift so subtle it almost felt imagined, like the air itself was watching to see what I would do next. By mid-morning, the schedule I had refused was no longer mentioned, no reminders, no quiet pressure, just absence, and that absence felt louder than any command. I wandered through rooms that looked untouched, a living room with pristine furniture that no one sat on, a dining table long enough to seat 20 people but set for none, a kitchen that functioned like a machine, efficient, silent, and operated entirely by people who never met my eyes for more than a second. They called me Mrs. Hale, every single one of them, but the way they said it felt like reading from a script, not recognition, not respect, just compliance. It made me wonder how long they had been here, how many rules they had learned not to question, and how many parts of themselves they had quietly set aside to survive in a place like this. I stepped outside sometime after noon, not because anyone told me I could, but because no one told me I could not, and the moment the fresh air hit my lungs, I realized how controlled everything inside had been, how even breathing felt different beyond those walls. The ground stretched wider than I expected, acres of perfectly maintained land that looked more like a private park than a home, with trimmed hedges, stone paths, and a stillness that felt intentional, like even nature here had been disciplined. I followed one of the paths without thinking, my steps slow, my mind louder than the silence around me, replaying every moment since I arrived, every word, every glance, every absence, until I heard something that did not belong to the quiet. A voice, soft but firm, coming from somewhere beyond the hedges, followed by another, lower, controlled, and unmistakably his. I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting before my thoughts caught up, and I moved closer just enough to see through the narrow gap between the leaves. Victor stood there, exactly as he had the night before, composed, precise, his presence filling the space without effort, speaking to a man I did not recognize, their conversation low but clear enough for me to catch pieces of it. "I do not repeat myself," Victor said, his tone calm, not raised, not threatening, but final in a way that made the other man straighten immediately. There was no argument, no pushback, just acceptance, like the outcome had already been decided the moment Victor spoke. I should have walked away, should have given him the same distance he had given me, but something held me there, something that needed to understand the man I had been tied to, not as a husband, but as a force I could not ignore. Then it happened, something small, almost invisible. The other man handed Victor a folder, and as Victor reached for it, his sleeve shifted just enough for me to see the edge of something unexpected, not a weapon, not a sign of power, but a thin, worn bracelet, simple, out of place against everything else about him. It was gone a second later, hidden again beneath the perfection of his suit, but I had seen it, and for the first time since he spoke those 3 words, I felt something different, not fear, not anger, but curiosity, because men who believed in nothing did not keep things like that, and suddenly, I was not sure which part of him was the truth, the man who erased me with a sentence, or the one who carried something he did not want the world to see. I should have walked away, but I did not, and that choice stayed with me long after I returned inside, long after the sun began to dip behind the tall hedges and the house returned to its usual controlled silence, because once you see something that does not fit, you cannot pretend it was never there. The bracelet did not belong to the man I had met, not to the version of him that spoke in absolutes and erased people with a sentence, and yet it existed, hidden just beneath the surface, like a crack in something that was supposed to be unbreakable. I kept thinking about it as the hours passed, as I sat in a room that was now supposedly mine, surrounded by things I did not choose, wearing a name that did not feel like mine, trying to understand the rules of a life no one had explained to me. Dinner came without invitation, a quiet knock followed by the same woman from earlier, her expression unchanged, her movements precise as she set the table for one. "Mr. Hale will be dining later," she said, as if that explained everything, as if his absence was not something to question but something to accept. I almost asked her about the bracelet, almost broke whatever invisible line existed between curiosity and survival, but something stopped me, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the understanding that information here was not given freely, it was observed, collected, and used carefully. So I nodded instead, sat down, and ate in silence, the sound of my fork against the plate echoing louder than it should have in a house this large. I did not realize how late it had gotten until I heard the front doors open, a distant sound that somehow carried through the entire space, followed by footsteps that did not rush, did not hesitate, just moved with purpose, the same way everything about him did. I stayed where I was, not out of obedience, but because I wanted to see what he would do if I did not disappear. He entered the room without looking surprised to find me there, as if he had already calculated the possibility, his gaze passing over me briefly before settling on the chair across the table. He sat down, not asking, not acknowledging, just existing in the same space like it was a coincidence that meant nothing. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence between us felt different this time, not empty, not dismissive, but waiting. "You ignored the schedule," he said finally, his voice as calm as it had been the night before, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than my defiance. I met his gaze without lowering mine, the way I had promised myself I would, the way I had decided was the only way I would survive this. "It was not mine to follow," I replied, my voice steady even though I could feel my pulse in my throat. He watched me for a second longer than necessary, not reacting, not correcting, just observing, and then something unexpected happened, something so small it might have gone unnoticed if I had not been looking for it. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not approval, but acknowledgement. "You will learn," he said, not as a threat, not as a command, but as a statement, and I realized then that he was not trying to force me into the system the way I expected, he was waiting to see how I would move within it. I should have felt relieved, but I did not, because that meant something worse, something more complicated. He was not interested in controlling every step I took, he was interested in understanding why I would take them at all. He stood up before I could respond, his chair sliding back without a sound, and as he turned to leave, the light caught his wrist again, just for a second, just enough for me to see the edge of that same bracelet, worn, simple, human. "Mr. Hale," I said before I could stop myself, the name feeling less foreign this time, more deliberate, and he paused, not turning, just stopping. I hesitated, the question forming and dissolving all at once, because I knew the answer would matter more than I was ready for, but the silence stretched, and in that moment, I understood something I had not before. He might have decided I meant nothing, but he was still listening, and that meant I was not invisible, not entirely. He did not turn around, but he did not leave either, and that hesitation felt louder than anything he had said so far, because a man like Victor Hale did not pause without reason. I stood there, caught between speaking and staying silent, between asking a question I had no right to ask and walking away like I was expected to, but something in me had already crossed that line the moment I said his name. "That bracelet," I said before I could stop myself, the words quieter than I intended but clear enough to reach him, "it does not match the rest of you." The second it left my mouth, I felt the weight of it, not fear exactly, but the awareness that I had just stepped into something personal in a place where nothing personal was ever acknowledged. For a moment, nothing happened, and I thought maybe I had miscalculated, maybe this was the point where the rules would finally be enforced, where I would be reminded of my place in a way that could not be ignored, but instead, he exhaled, slow and controlled, like he had expected many things from me but not this. When he finally turned, his expression had not changed, still composed, still unreadable, but there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, something I could not name yet. "It is not meant to," he said, his voice even, not defensive, not dismissive, just factual, and that answer should have ended it, should have closed the door I had just opened, but it did not. I took a step closer without thinking, not enough to challenge him, just enough to show I was not retreating, and for the first time, I noticed the difference in height, in presence, in everything that separated us, but I did not lower my gaze. "Then why keep it?" I asked, and this time, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, not controlled, but deliberate, like he was deciding whether the question deserved an answer at all. His eyes held mine longer than before, searching, measuring, not for weakness, but for something else, something I did not fully understand, and then he did something unexpected, something that shifted the entire space between us. He stepped closer. Not aggressively, not abruptly, just one step, but it was enough to change everything, enough to make the air feel heavier, enough to remind me exactly who he was and exactly where I stood. "You ask questions like you have not learned yet," he said quietly, and there was no anger in it, no warning, just observation, like he was studying a pattern he had not seen before. I should have stepped back, should have softened, should have remembered every reason I had to be careful here, but instead, I held my ground, because something about this moment felt important in a way I could not explain. "Maybe I do not want to learn that part," I replied, my voice steady even as my heart pressed harder against my ribs, and for a second, something in his expression shifted again, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. He looked at me like I had said something that mattered. The distance between us did not change, but the tension did, less like a wall, more like a line being drawn slowly, carefully, between two people who were no longer pretending the other did not exist. His gaze dropped briefly, just for a second, to his wrist, to the place where the bracelet was hidden beneath his sleeve, and when he looked back at me, his voice was lower, not softer, but closer to something real. "Some things are not kept because they belong," he said, each word measured, controlled, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "They are kept because they remind you what you lost." The words settled between us, heavier than anything he had said before, and in that moment, I understood something I had not expected. This man who had reduced me to nothing carried something he could not let go of, something that still had power over him, and suddenly, the balance shifted, not in a way that changed who he was, but in a way that changed how I saw him. He turned again after that, not waiting for a response, not offering anything more, but this time, when he walked away, it did not feel like dismissal, it felt like distance, chosen, controlled, and maybe, just maybe, necessary. His words stayed with me long after he left, not because of how they sounded, but because of what they revealed. A man who claimed nothing mattered still carried something that did, something he could not erase, and for the first time since I arrived, I realized this house was not the only place built on control. He was too. I did not follow him, did not try to continue the conversation, because instinct told me that whatever I had just uncovered was not something to push, it was something to understand slowly, carefully, the way you approach something fragile without breaking it. That night, I did not return to the room they had given me right away. Instead I walked, through hallways that felt less intimidating now, through spaces that no longer seemed entirely empty, because once you see even a single crack, the entire structure starts to look different. The next morning came without announcement, just light filtering through tall windows and the quiet presence of the house waking up around me, staff moving in precise patterns, doors opening and closing with practiced timing, everything exactly where it should be, except me. I found myself in the kitchen without planning to be there, drawn by the one place that felt less controlled, less staged, where the rhythm was human, not rehearsed. A young woman stood at the counter, carefully arranging plates, her movements quick but not mechanical, and when she noticed me, she froze for half a second before straightening. "Mrs. Hale," she said, her voice softer than the others, less practiced, more real, and I realized she had not been here as long, not yet trained to disappear completely. "You do not have to call me that," I said without thinking, the words coming easier than I expected, and for a moment, she looked surprised, like I had just broken a rule she did not know could be broken. "It is what we are told," she replied quietly, and I nodded, because I understood that rules did not need to be explained when they were enforced by habit. I moved closer to the counter, noticing the small details, the way she double-checked everything, the way her hands hesitated just slightly before placing each item, like she was afraid of getting it wrong. "What is your name?" I asked, and this time, the hesitation lasted longer, not out of fear, but uncertainty, like she was not sure if she was allowed to answer. "Lily," she said finally, almost under her breath, and I smiled, a small, genuine reaction that felt unfamiliar in a place like this. "Thank you, Lily," I said, and something shifted in her expression, just a little, just enough to show that being seen mattered, even here. I reached for one of the plates without asking, helping her carry it to the table, and for a second, she looked like she might stop me, might remind me that this was not my role, but she did not, she just watched, unsure of how to respond. "He does not usually eat here in the morning," she said after a moment, like she felt the need to explain, and I nodded again, because I already knew that, already understood that Victor Hale existed in this house without truly living in it. "That is fine," I replied, setting the plate down carefully, "neither do I." The words felt simple, but they carried something more, a quiet decision, a refusal to fall into patterns that were not mine, and as I stepped back, I felt it again, that same steady resistance, stronger now, more certain. I was still in his world, still bound by choices I did not make, but I was starting to understand something important. This place did not change people overnight, it reshaped them slowly, through silence, through routine, through the absence of choice, and if I was going to survive here, I could not let that happen without noticing, without pushing back, even in the smallest ways. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls and the rules and the carefully controlled life, I wondered if he noticed too, not the actions, not the defiance, but the fact that I was still here, still moving, still choosing, in a place that had already decided I should be nothing. I did not expect something small to matter, but it did, and it happened later that afternoon when the quiet of the house broke in a way that did not fit the pattern I had been learning. It started with raised voices, not loud, not chaotic, but sharp enough to cut through the controlled silence, and instinct pulled me toward it before I had time to think. The sound led me to a corridor I had not walked before, one that felt less polished, more functional, where the illusion of perfection faded just enough to show the machinery underneath. I slowed as I approached the corner, not hiding, not exactly, just careful, because I had already learned that everything here had layers, and stepping into the wrong one without understanding it could cost more than I was ready to give. Two men stood near a doorway, both in dark suits, both carrying the same quiet authority I had seen around Victor, but something about their posture was different, less composed, more urgent. "He said it needs to be handled today," one of them said, his voice tight, controlled in the way people sound when they are trying not to lose control. "And I said it will be," the other replied, but there was hesitation in it, a crack that did not belong in a place like this. I should have turned back, should have left them to whatever business did not involve me, but then I heard another voice, softer, younger, and completely out of place. "Please," it said, and that one word changed everything, because it did not belong to this world of precision and control, it belonged to something human, something uncertain. I stepped forward before I could stop myself, just enough to see past the doorway, and what I found was not what I expected. A young boy sat on a chair inside the room, maybe 8 or 9 years old, his shoulders tense, his hands gripping the edge of the seat like it was the only thing keeping him steady. He looked out of place in every way, his clothes too simple, his expression too open, like he had been pulled into something he did not understand. The men noticed me immediately, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence, their attention shifting in a way that made it clear I was not supposed to be here. "This area is restricted," one of them said, his tone polite but firm, the kind of firmness that did not invite argument. I should have apologized, should have stepped back, should have done what was expected, but instead, I looked past him, back at the boy, and something in me refused to move. "He does not belong here," I said quietly, not accusing, not challenging, just stating what felt obvious, and the silence that followed was immediate, heavy, like I had said something that was not meant to be spoken aloud. The men exchanged a glance, brief but loaded, and for a moment, I thought that would be the end of it, that I would be dismissed like everything else that did not fit, but then the boy spoke again, his voice smaller this time. "I just want to go home." The words hit differently than anything else I had heard in this house, simple, honest, and completely out of place in a world where nothing was ever that direct. I took a step closer, ignoring the subtle shift in the men's posture, ignoring the quiet warning in their eyes, because something about this moment felt important in a way I could not ignore. "Where is your home?" I asked gently, and the boy looked at me like I had asked the only question that mattered. "It is not here," he said, and I nodded, because I understood that more than he realized. The tension in the room tightened, not explosive, not dangerous, but controlled in the way everything here was controlled, and I could feel it building, the invisible line I had crossed becoming clearer with every second I stayed. Then, without warning, the space shifted, not with sound, not with movement, but with presence, and I did not need to turn to know who had entered the corridor behind me. Victor Hale did not announce himself, he did not need to, the air changed around him, the same way it always did, and for a moment, no one spoke, not the men, not the boy, not even me. I stayed where I was, my attention still on the child, but I could feel Victor's gaze, not cold this time, not dismissive, but focused, like he was watching something unfold that he had not planned. "Explain," he said finally, one word, quiet, controlled, but enough to shift everything again, and I realized then that whatever happened next was no longer just about rules or roles, it was about choice, mine, his, and the space between them that neither of us fully controlled anymore. I did not turn around, not immediately, because if I did, I knew the moment would shift, and whatever fragile space existed between me and the boy would disappear under the weight of his presence. The men straightened as soon as Victor spoke, their uncertainty replaced by something sharper, more defined, like they had been waiting for direction all along. "The situation is contained," one of them said carefully, choosing each word like it mattered more than it should, but Victor did not respond to him, not yet, and that silence felt heavier than any command. I could feel his attention, not just on the room, not just on the men, but on me, on the fact that I had stepped into something I was never meant to see, and for the first time, I wondered if I had gone too far. The boy shifted in his seat, his eyes moving between us, confusion written clearly across his face, and I realized something then, he was not afraid of them the way I expected, he was unsure, uncertain, like he did not understand why he was here at all. "He said he wants to go home," I said finally, my voice steady even as the tension in the room tightened, and the words felt simple, but they landed differently here, in a place where nothing was ever that direct. The man closest to the door inhaled slightly, like he was about to speak, about to correct me, about to reframe the situation into something more acceptable, but Victor raised his hand just enough to stop him, a small movement, barely noticeable, but absolute. Silence followed again, controlled, deliberate, and then Victor stepped forward. Not toward the men, not toward the doorway, but toward me, and that choice did not go unnoticed. "You are not assigned to this," he said, his voice calm, not harsh, not raised, but firm in a way that made it clear he was not asking. I met his gaze, not defiant, not submissive, just present, because I understood now that disappearing was no longer an option. "No one is assigned to him," I replied, and the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the shift, not explosive, not dangerous, but significant, like something had just moved beneath the surface of everything we had built so far. The boy looked at me again, this time with something different in his expression, not just confusion, but recognition, like he understood that I was speaking for him in a way no one else had. Victor's eyes did not leave mine, and for a second, it felt like time had slowed, like the room had narrowed down to just the two of us and the space between what was expected and what was happening. "Explain why you are here," he said again, but this time, the question felt different, less about the situation and more about me, about why I had chosen to step into it at all. I took a breath, steadying myself. Because I knew this mattered, not just for the boy, but for whatever line I had already crossed. Because he should not have to ask to be seen, I said, the words coming out quieter than I intended but stronger than I expected, and the silence that followed was immediate, not empty, but full, like something had just been placed in the middle of the room that no one knew how to move. The men looked at Victor, waiting, always waiting, but he did not answer right away, and that delay felt like a decision in itself. His gaze shifted then, just slightly, from me to the boy, and for a brief moment, something changed in his expression, not enough to call it emotion, not enough to name it, but enough to notice. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice directed at the child now, not cold, not distant, just measured, and the boy hesitated before answering. "Ethan," he said softly, his fingers still gripping the edge of the chair. Victor nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and then looked back at me, and in that moment, I understood something I had not before. This was not about breaking rules, it was about rewriting them, slowly, carefully, one choice at a time. "He will be taken home," Victor said finally, his tone leaving no room for question, and the shift in the room was immediate, the tension easing just enough to breathe again. The men nodded, moving without argument, without hesitation, because his decision was final. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath, my shoulders relaxing just slightly, and when I looked back at Ethan, his expression had changed too, not completely, not all at once, but enough to show that something had shifted for him as well. Victor turned to leave after that, the moment already closing, the structure reasserting itself, but just before he stepped away, he paused, not looking at me directly this time, but not ignoring me either. "This is not your role," he said quietly, and for a second, I thought he was correcting me, putting everything back into place the way it was supposed to be, but then he added, almost as an afterthought, "But you chose it anyway." And that was not dismissal, that was recognition, and somehow, that mattered more than anything else he had said so far. The house returned to silence after that, but it was not the same silence I had walked into before. It was different now, less absolute, less suffocating, like something invisible had shifted just enough to let the air move again. I stood there for a moment longer after Ethan was led away, watching the doorway where he had been, listening to the fading footsteps, and for the first time since I arrived, the space did not feel like it was closing in on me, it felt like it was waiting. I did not follow anyone, did not try to understand where they were taking him, because I already knew it would be handled, not out of blind trust, but because I had seen the decision in Victor's eyes, the kind that did not change once it was made. Instead, I turned and walked back through the corridor, slower this time, more aware of everything around me, the walls, the doors, the people who moved quietly through the space, each of them part of something larger, something structured, something controlled, and yet, not as untouchable as it had seemed before. When I reached the main hall, I stopped, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I realized something I had not allowed myself to see until now. I was no longer just reacting to this place, I was changing it, even if only in small ways, even if only in moments that most people would never notice. That thought stayed with me as the evening settled in, as the lights dimmed and the house shifted into its quieter rhythm, and when I heard his footsteps again, I did not feel the same distance I had felt before. He entered the room without announcement, as always, his presence steady, controlled, unchanged on the surface, but I could not unsee what I had seen, the hesitation, the choice, the part of him that did not fit the role he had built so perfectly. I did not wait for him to speak this time, did not let the silence define the moment the way it had before. "You listened," I said, the words simple, but they carried more than they should have, and for a second, I thought he might dismiss it, reduce it to nothing the way he had reduced. everything else at the beginning, but he did not. He looked at me, directly, without looking away, and that alone felt different. I made a decision, he replied, his tone even, but there was something beneath it now, something less distant, something closer to truth. I nodded, because I understood the difference, because in his world, listening was not the same as choosing, and choosing was what mattered. Most people here do not question you, I said, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, just an observation, and his expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, like he was waiting to see where I would go with it. And you do, he said, not asking, not surprised, just stating it the way he stated everything else, and for the first time, I allowed myself to answer without hesitation. I do not belong to this place, I said, and the words felt steady, grounded, not defiant, just true, and something in his gaze shifted again, not enough to call it agreement, but enough to show he was considering it. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, like something unspoken had settled between us, something that did not need to be explained yet. He stepped closer then, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to make it clear that he was no longer keeping the same space he had before, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not softer, but more deliberate. "Neither do I," he said, and the words landed in a way I did not expect, because they were not dramatic, not heavy, just honest in a way that did not fit the man I had met on the first night. I looked at him then, really looked, past the control, past the precision, past the version of him that had told me I meant nothing, and for the first time, I saw something else, not weakness, not regret, but something unfinished, something still in motion. The room felt different again, not because anything had changed physically, but because the space between us had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever we were becoming inside this controlled world, it was no longer defined by the rules that brought me here. He had the power to own everything, to control every outcome, to decide every detail, but in that moment, standing there with nothing but silence and truth between us, I understood something that changed everything. He could control the world, but he could not control what I chose to be inside it, and for the first time since this began, that choice felt like it mattered.